Good morning. Today we are going to take a look at Chapter 2 in our textbook. And before we get started with that, and before I kind of lay out some of the general themes that are important in Chapter 2, I want to be clear on some of the things that were discussed in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 primarily dealt with the interaction between the Native Americans and the Spanish, as well as other Europeans that engaged in what became known as the Columbian Exchange. In fact, that really was the focus of Chapter 1, to talk about Native American societies prior to the arrival of Columbus, to discuss the nature of the Spanish conquest of the New World, and to deal with some of the long-term effects of what is known as the Columbian Exchange, this great transfer of goods, of plants, animals, technology, trade between the Old World and the New. Chapter 2 takes a different focus as we progress. In Chapter 2, we get away from the story of the Spanish and we deal with the French, the Dutch, and the English. And Chapter 2, by the time we get to the end of it, develops a very clear distinction between the northern and southern colonies of the English colonization efforts. And that is very important going forward, to understand the diversity of the English colonial experiment, and to realize that there were really marked distinctions between the northern and southern colonies. And of course, it's also very important to keep in mind how the English experience was very different from the Dutch, from the French, and of course from the Spanish, because all of those folks will be very important players in this contest of empires that will eventually play out in chapters 3 and 4. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. And the first thing to do is just to recall that the Spanish had primarily limited their exploration of the New World to the south, whereas France and England will be exploring what we know these days as North America. And that was largely because that was all that was left. So when the English and the French got involved, they knew that they could not contest Spanish power in Central and Southern America, but they could begin to explore and see what the potential was for trade and later on settlement in North America. Of course, the original reason to get involved in exploration for all European countries was to find this all-water route to Asia. This was something that Columbus was obsessed with, and it was the dream that really never died, this idea of trying to find a Northwest Passage. Of course, it does not exist. We know that now by taking a look at a map, but that was unknown at the time. A secondary goal, at least in the early going, was to try and acquire some of the mineral wealth that the Spanish had been so successful in acquiring. But of course, that didn't pan out as well for the French and the English either. And so what we will see is, after some real false starts, both the French and the English and the Dutch will begin to develop a very distinct form of colonization, distinct from the Spanish that we saw in Chapter 1. When we think about the idea of the French getting involved in North America, it's important to realize that one of the things that was playing out at the time of the Age of Exploration was the Reformation. And the Reformation was essentially a religious movement in which you had the Protestants, followers of folks like Martin Luther and later John Calvin, rebelling against the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And this created a series of religious wars in Europe. And for France and Spain, very Catholic countries, one of the issues that would constantly bedevil them, if you will, is the need to assert their dominance by way of the church, the Catholic Church. And this meant that they wanted to control their colonization efforts in a way that promoted their Catholicism. As we will see later, the English don't have this problem because the English under Henry VIII will become Protestant, and so they will not have this need to try and control a global empire based on Catholic uniformity. Instead, they'll be quite willing to entertain lots of different ideas and beliefs that in the end will allow for some real diverse experiments in the New World. When we think about the English experience with the Reformation, before we deal with some of the French and Dutch exploration efforts, it's important to realize that it was Henry VIII that created the formal break with the Catholic Church. This was primarily over the fact that he could not get an annulment of a marriage, that the Pope would not look favorably upon that, and King Henry VIII believed it was within his power to break ties from the Catholic Church and to set out on his own. Of course, one of the children of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, will eventually take control, and she's the one that we should really associate with what will be kind of the foundations of English expansion. Of course, England will have quite a decisive showdown with Spain, and most of us should be familiar with, of course, the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English in 1588. Of course, surrounding this was the emergence of England as a seafaring power, which again will provide a critical foundation for their success in the New World. So we can say that one of the things that definitely helped the English was, of course, the Protestant Reformation. But another thing that helped the English was, of course, their emergence as a naval power. They also will be very successful in terms of realizing some real productive capacity, whether it be the mining in their own country of coal, lead, and iron, and of course their hunger for timber, wood, which in many ways will kind of propel them forth into the New World. So when we contrast the English experience with the other great European empires, it's important to remember that while their advantages will not be realized for a very long time, those advantages will prove to be decisive. England will be a Protestant power, it will be a sea power, and of course it will have an abundance of natural resources that will help fuel their exploration. But on top of that, they will have a great hunger to go exploring, particularly when you consider some of their needs in terms of timber and other resources. This is one of the reasons that as these developments begin to take shape, you see a lot of propaganda efforts in England to essentially, get colonization going. And so you have some very interesting people. You have kind of the original pirate of the Caribbean, if you will, Sir Francis Drake, who will be one of these kind of intrepid explorers. And of course you have some of the folks that did go exploring and some of the folks that didn't go exploring, people like the Gilbert brothers, who will kind of propagandize the need for England to get out there and to make its presence known in the world. Of course, it takes a very long time for this to happen. Richard Halkett is another kind of propagandist, if you will, who talks about how important it would be for England to go exploring not only for natural resources but to get rid of the excess people in England. He's talking primarily about folks that were driven off the land through the enclosure movement and were now kind of teeming in the cities. We're talking about the urban poor, that the New World would be a very good place for them to go. We will get very early on, so here we are before we even talk about the French and the Dutch, we do get some early English colonial experiments, particularly the what becomes known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke, which is under the direction of Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Roanoke is just off of North Carolina, and it was successful for a little while, at least in terms of establishing some kind of a foothold for the English in America. There were actually a series of very fine artworks produced by John White, an artist who went with the expedition and captured some of what was going on in terms of the English colony of Roanoke. The actual person that is responsible for the direction of the Roanoke colony and will ultimately become synonymous with the tragic fate of the Roanoke colony is Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh, of course, was somebody who was very close to the Queen, and he's the one that really kind of set up the expedition to establish the Roanoke colony. But of course, the Roanoke colony is a place that eventually is abandoned, and we don't know quite why. We know that folks were there and were supposed to be resupplied, but when the resupply ships returned, they found that the colony had been abandoned, and there was only a few signs that it had ever been there, including a very cryptic word inscribed on a tree, Croatan, which still to this day remains a mystery. We're not sure if the original colonists, the English colonists at Roanoke, were absorbed into a Native American tribe, whether they were wiped out, whether they tried to flee and died out, but the lost colony of Roanoke was obviously a failure. And of course, it will take the English a little bit longer to establish a real foothold in the New World. One lesson to be learned here is just how difficult it is to establish colonies in North America. It takes a while, whether it be the English, the French, the Dutch. It's not nearly as easy as what we saw with the conquistadors and the Spanish when it came to Central and South America. If we consider the French experience in the New World, which is what the book focuses on before we return to the English, they focus on the French and the Dutch. Things to remember about the French is that the French were successful in terms of exploring what we would typically think of as kind of the Great Lakes region and up into Canada. We did talk about earlier Jacques Cartier, but of course we can talk about the Jesuit expeditions into places that are now very familiar to us, places like Montreal. But the thing to really keep in mind with the French is that they were interested in trade. They realized right off the bat that they had run into some Native Americans, particularly the Iroquois, who were going to put up some pretty stiff resistance, and so they negotiated more than anything else. They knew they couldn't remove the Native Americans in order to establish their settlements, and so they basically created trading outposts. Montreal was effectively a trading outpost. And while the Jesuits were there to work on conversion, most of the Frenchmen who went, of course, were interested in trade, and particularly trade in furs, because those became very, very valuable in Europe. The problem with the French, of course, is that there aren't that many that are able to come into the New World. And this is primarily because of that Protestant Reformation. Because France was interested in creating a new world that was Catholic, they forbade their Protestant countrymen, folks known as Huguenots, from leaving France. So I want you to think about the contrast that we'll have with places like England, where in many cases, if we go back to Sir Humphrey Gilbert's ideas and others, the idea that England should get rid of some of its troublemakers, so to speak. It's probably a crass way to put it, but the idea was that the New World offered this opportunity to have the discontented leave. France didn't do that because they were interested in really controlling what happened in the New World and making sure that it was New France, very much on the order of what we saw earlier with New Spain, and that means Catholic. And so the footprint for the French is always going to be very light in North America, and of course this will be very important later on when we discuss things like the French and Indian War. Of course, the Dutch are another factor here. They were also another trading empire, and the Dutch, particularly once they freed themselves from Spanish rule, the Dutch would be in a great position to establish some trading outposts in North America, and they will do this. The most famous trading outpost is, of course, New Amsterdam, which will later, once taken over by the English, become New York. We still consider New York to be, almost the quintessential American city. And it is actually established by the Dutch. Now, the Dutch had a very interesting system of settlement. They were interested in trade, but they also were interested in having landlords kind of control what they would refer to as a plantation. They had what was known as the patroon system. Effectively, what this meant was there were some very rich Dutch folks that were in charge of New Amsterdam, but by and large, under their control, there were a lot of very interesting things, a lot of things we would consider very American these days. There was religious tolerance. There were slaves, but there were also free African Americans. And women had much more freedom than they did in most places at this time in the world. And of course, the Dutch maintained very good relations with the Indians, the Native Americans, because they worked on trade with them and maintained a very good set of trade networks with the Native Americans. And so when we think about the Dutch, we should really consider some of these ideas that we typically think of as American and think of them instead as Dutch, at least to begin with. The book also mentions the contributions of the Swedes and the Finns. So if we think about some of these Scandinavian folks, they were also involved in the mix. The Swedes are actually responsible for the development of the log cabin. They will also be involved in the New World in North America. And we can talk about places like the Delaware Valley as being highly influenced by these Scandinavian folks, these Swedish folks. And so it's worth considering. In fact, the idea of the frontiersman, again, a very rugged American concept, very much something that is a product of both the Swedes and the Finns. Finland and Sweden giving us that contribution. So, just to take a moment here before we turn back to the English experience and contrast the southern with the northern colonies, let's consider that a lot of what we consider to be basic kind of American ideas, concepts, images um, are representative of other countries' cultures, whether it be um, the French, the Dutch, the Swedish, or the Finnish. And of course, there will be many others that could be added to the mix as well, including Native Americans, who will have an enormous effect on kind of American identity and still do. Well, we talked about the English having that lost colony of Roanoke. The book, uh, of course, is more interested, as are we, in talking about not the failed colony, but the more successful colony, at least over the long term, that was established in Virginia. And here, of course, we're talking about Jamestown. Jamestown was a colony that was established through a joint stock company, and it was known as the Virginia Company. A joint stock company is very much a forerunner of the corporation, allowed people to pool their wealth in order to invest in this venture. A lot of the folks who invested did not make the trip to Jamestown themselves, but generally speaking, were able to recruit people to go and to essentially set up what would become the first successful English colony in North America. And we can talk about Jamestown as the first English colony that is not only successful but also the first real kind of fixture of the English in America. And Virginia is still, it's known as the Old Dominion State. It is very, very important to this day. 1607 is the date that we have for the establishment of Jamestown. Of course, things were not going very well in Jamestown. A lot of the English who were recruited to go over were interested in looking for gold and other treasure. Again, trying to repeat the success of the Spanish. Of course, that did not happen. Things fell into some pretty severe situations. And of course, we have one of our first great kind of Americans, if you will, depending on what your definition of that is, John Smith, who of course brings order to the Jamestown colony, implements a fairly severe work system, and allows for Jamestown to survive, despite the fact that there will be some awful circumstances that will take place. The other thing to keep in mind with Jamestown is that because it was a corporation, if you will, a joint stock company, it had a charter. The charter was granted by the king, but in the charter there was specific contract language that essentially developed the idea that the colonists had a certain degree of rights. They had a certain degree of independence. Now, there was, of course, a governor that was established to kind of direct what went on in Virginia, but by and large, Virginia would become an independent colony. And this would be very, very important because this idea of independence, this idea of English colonists doing it themselves, is obviously going to lead to some pretty big ideas later on. Contrast this with New France, New Spain, trying to establish some real top-down control in terms of creating a Catholic New World Empire. The English are going to have a very different experience. Of course, what really saves Jamestown is not so much their charter of liberties, as we might look at it later on, or even John Smith, who instilled order, although he did ensure that Jamestown would survive. It was another guy named John Rolfe who introduced the first cash crop for the English in America, and that would be tobacco. Basically took some varieties from the West Indies, transplanted them up to Virginia, and it took off, and the rest is really history. Now, of course, the only problem that Virginia would have going forward would be to get enough laborers into the colony in order to produce the tobacco. And this is why we have this system of indentured servitude that will take hold, and later, of course, slavery. This idea that labor was the big concern, particularly in a place like Virginia, led to all kinds of ideas being thrown about. Of course, indentured servitude was typically a contract that lasted anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and once that contract was up, you would have the ability, those people would have the ability to acquire land of their own if they survived. Conditions were terrible in terms of disease in Virginia. Of course, there was the headright system, which was supposed to guarantee that if people brought over laborers, that they would be given a certain amount of acreage in Virginia. And of course, slavery, which will become kind of the labor force that will be preferred, particularly after a nasty set of situations that occur known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Another development to really seize upon here is the development of the first colonial legislature, known as the House of Burgesses, which will be set up in 1619. This also happens to be the year that the first African slaves will be imported into the English colonies. Relations with the Native Americans were not very good. In fact, they led to a series of wars that in some cases threatened to wipe out the experiment at Jamestown in Virginia. Eventually, though, the English colonists will be able to hold their own, and they will push back the Native Americans. And of course, that's the beginning of kind of a familiar story in terms of the English experience in the Americas. Another thing to note about the colony of Virginia is that eventually Virginia will become what is known as a royal colony. It will have its charter revoked or canceled. And that's an interesting preview of some of what we will see in terms of the tug of war between the colonies and the mother country. And it's interesting to take notice of that and to realize that there's always this tension that exists between the mother country and the colonies. It's important, too, to realize that because England is 3,000 miles away, even if they do have control, even if they do turn a colony into a royal colony, that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to basically devise all the laws that are necessary for that colony's operation. Those are still going to have to be decided on the ground. And that's important to note as well, because no matter how much control England might wish to have, chances are they're not going to be able to have that over the long term. Other colonies that were established in the South and were very much kind of centered around, kind of agriculture, kind of plantation-based production would be colonies such as Maryland, that was originally set up as a refuge for Catholics under Lord Baltimore. Later on, we will see that we will have the Carolinas introduced, as well as some of the other colonies, including Georgia. But for now, just speaking in terms of Virginia and Maryland, we've got this southern kind of way of life, this land-based way of life, and it is on this basis that we see the development of kind of the great families of the American South that were essentially trying to replicate what the great landlords did back in England. So it is important to realize that in Virginia, in Maryland, there was an attempt to kind of recreate kind of the aristocratic distinction that existed in England. And that's important to keep in mind, not only in terms of some of the eventual problems with the mother country, but also even after independence, some of the distinctive identity of Southern Americans. Some of those identities, I suppose you could say, still exist in many ways in our country today. All right, we've talked about the Southern colonies. And it's important to realize that there's an enormous contrast with what we will call the Northern colonies. And here we are primarily dealing with colonies that will constitute New England. So we're talking about Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Plymouth, and New Haven. Not all of those colonies, not all of those settlements will eventually become states, but they all represent New England. And New England is what we really want to get a grasp of. If we talk about the southern colonies, we can talk about them being the Chesapeake colonies. But New England is a very different set of colonies that will be developed to the north. A couple major themes of New England colonies is that there will be a much more varied economy. There will be cash crops in New England, but by and large there will be a variety of cash crops. There will be a variety of production. So the economy is more complicated. Entire families will go to New England. This is not true in the southern colonies, where mostly men went, certainly early on, and they actually had to import women in order to develop the population. New England will have an exploding population as a result of all those families coming in. And of course, it will be a population that is very distinct, primarily because of the Puritan influence. We talked about England being a Protestant country. It's important to realize that there were very extreme Protestants known as Puritans. We didn't speak of these folks when we talked about the southern colonies, because while the Church of England and religion was important in the South, it was nothing compared to the religious zeal that we will see in the northern colonies in New England, where the Puritans actually had the goal of purifying the Church of England, which meant that they saw a lot of faults with what was going on in the mother country, and they saw those faults from the very beginning, which perhaps explains why we will see New England kind of be the epicenter, if you will, of the American Revolution. If we talk about the Puritans, we're talking about primarily folks that were very dissatisfied with the conditions that they saw in England. And we're talking primarily of folks that would constitute what we might refer to as kind of middle class people. The Puritans were a relatively successful bunch. They were interested in commercial economy, and that made them fairly successful. So they weren't necessarily going to the New World eventually because they were desperate or because they were hoping to strike it rich. They would go to the New World primarily because they wanted to show that they kind of had the right way of life, and they figured that it would become an example to the old world as to how to live. So when we talk about the Puritans, we are talking about folks that essentially have this religious zeal, and that pretty much motivates everything in life. Their prosperity has to do with their kind of commercial acumen, if you will, but it also has to do with the fact that they led very kind of, uh, industrious, uh, not necessarily sober, but industrious, sober lives that allowed them to be very kind of calm and calculating in terms of how they manage the prosperity of themselves and their families. Now, the original group of Protestants that will leave England because they're dissatisfied with England will be known as the Pilgrims. We all know about the Pilgrims from the Mayflower colony, but before uh, the uh, the colony established at Plymouth Rock, uh, we should know that these Pilgrims had actually left to go to um, the Netherlands. They had actually gone to become Dutch in a sense, or I should say, live in the Netherlands. They were actually worried about becoming Dutch. They were worried about their kids becoming Dutch. They didn't like the way that the Dutch were so uh, loose with their lifestyle, and so that pushed the Pilgrims out of the Netherlands and caused them to immigrate under a charter from the king to establish their own company to immigrate to the New World. Of course, it's later in the 1630s that we see the development of what will become Massachusetts. When we talk about the Puritans, we talk about a great Puritan exodus in the 1830s. And of course, it's the Puritans that were interested not simply from separating from the Church of England as the Pilgrims were interested in, but in actually purifying the Church of England by setting up a great example. As John Winthrop will say, the Puritans were supposed to become a city upon a hill to kind of demonstrate to England and the rest of the Old World what it was like to live a good kind of middle class Puritan life, hoping that everyone else would follow that. As a result of the establishment of these New England colonies, you see a very distinct form of American life, and this should be contrasted strongly with what we saw in the South. First of all, we talked about entire families going to the New World, and this meant that the entire family was put to productive use. And this meant, too, that it was important because of their religious convictions for uh, the children of Puritans to learn to read the Bible and therefore receive an education which would also help them to become productive members of society. Everything was built around kind of town-centered government and, of course, work. The book goes into great detail in terms of how important work was for the Puritans. Industriousness was a godly virtue, the authors say. And it meant that, work, church, family, these were the things that were critically important in New England. And of course, the idea that New England had this whole new model for how human beings should live and wanted to be an example to the old world. This contrasts strongly with the South and the Southern colonies that in many ways tried to emulate or imitate the example of the old world. The Puritans were different. They were trying to show that they were kind of the new model of what society should look like. This meant that they were not very good about people who disagreed with them. And you can see this when it comes to a couple famous religious dissenters, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, both of whom were very religious folks, maybe even in some cases more extreme than the Puritans. Certainly Roger Williams was in many ways. They were effectively banished from the colonies, from, I should say, the colony of Massachusetts, because of their dissension. They went against the Puritan orthodoxy. Roger Williams was successful in settling Rhode Island, and one of the reasons that Rhode Island continues to maintain its distinct identity to this day is because of its origins as being kind of this dissenting colony. And Hutchison will flee to Rhode Island, but will later be killed in a Native American attack. And you know, this is something that was interpreted by the Puritans as kind of divine justice. That's how strict and tough they were in terms of their critics. So, not really interested in too much criticism. But of course, the success of New England, because of their kind of strict lifestyle, created a prosperity that led to a lot of expansion. And so when we talk about the development of colonies such as Connecticut, we are dealing with, you know, in many ways, the unbridled prosperity of these Puritan societies. They may have been strict, and they may have been religiously orthodox and very straight-laced, but they were very successful, very prosperous, and they were fiercely independent. One thing to note, and this is a point of comparison with the southern colonies, is that in New England they took their independence very seriously. They wanted to be this model community, which meant they wanted to have total control over what they were doing, which meant that they decided things locally. The town meeting was very important. The writing of constitutions will be important in places like New England. And of course, because they figured they had life figured out, they weren't too interested in doing much with the Native Americans outside of maintaining some level of trade and of course maintaining their boundaries, you know, pushing the Native Americans back. This is why the Puritans could be quite brutal with the Native Americans, because they were interested in really defending their kind of unique lifestyle, and they weren't going to tolerate dissent from within. They weren't going to take too many orders from without, if you consider you know, the mother country, and they certainly weren't going to negotiate with the Native Americans. And this led to some very terrible things, such as the Pequot War and the wipeout of an entire group of Native Americans at Mystic Lake. This was an extremely brutal situation in which the Puritans kind of enlisted the help of other Native Americans to effectively, you know, commit something on the order of a genocide. It was pretty terrible. Now, the last section of the book here, and the final element of this chapter, is to talk about, you know, how English were the English colonies. I mean, obviously, we've talked about the interest of the southern colonies in wanting to imitate kind of the aristocratic lifestyles of folks in England, particularly kind of the gentry, the country landowners in England. Many Southerners kind of styled themselves after this. But when we talk about the English colonies as a whole, north and south, are we looking at a place that is English, so to speak? Well, it depends on how you look at it. By and large, the English lifestyle was replicated in many ways. If you think about what was produced, if you think about just the basic industry, there were an iron industry that developed particularly in places like New England. There was, of course, the timber industry, the fishing industry. All of this will provide a source of materials for England, and there will be really well-functioning trade networks that will exist between the colonies and the mother country. And we will see that in many ways the colonies fit right into kind of the economic order that England sought to develop. So when we think about the colonies, we're looking at, on some level, the development of kind of a miniature England. Um, the colonists were there to stay, and they were there to flourish, and so they will develop industry that will allow them to do that. Um, by and large, this was welcomed by the mother country, England, because it complemented their economy. The problems that would develop later would be in defining the specific role for the colonies to play, whether they really were supposed to just produce raw materials or whether they were supposed to produce their own finished products. Later on, England, the mother country, will try and kind of stipulate that they're the ones that supply, finished products, and that the colonies really should only supply raw materials, and everything they need that is a finished product should be bought from England. They'll try and really reduce their trade with other countries, whether we talk about the French, the Dutch, the Spanish. And so there will be an attempt later on to kind of tighten up what role the colonies and the mother country should play. This will be known as kind of the economic doctrine of mercantilism. But for now, in the early going, as these colonies are established, we see that there is great diversity in the colonial economy, particularly when you look at the colony of New England, or the set of colonies that correspond with the New England region, and that it will be the case that the success of the colonies will almost become something that the mother country envies and covets. And so I think that's probably where we should leave it in terms of the most important themes of this chapter. The English have a very difficult time in establishing their presence in the New World, but by the time they do, they develop a real distinct and diverse set of colonies that will create an unbelievable amount of prosperity and an unbelievable amount of population for the time. And this will lead to a situation where the mother country, England, kind of revisits what it means to have colonies, what it means to have an empire, and how they can best kind of direct the wealth of the empire. And this will really create kind of the seeds of some of the revolution that will take place between the colonies and the British later on down the line. All right, that is pretty much the full sweep of Chapter 2. I appreciate your attention. I hope you hung in there the whole time. Good luck reading the book. It is a great book to read. There's lots of detail that is invaluable. And I can only hope that these video lectures have been helpful too, in terms of making sure that you're on the right track and not missing the most important material and themes. Thank you.